Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us for today's business hour, the Founder's Exit Strategy from Beginning to End. My name is Frank Wardega. I'm a member of our business department and with a focus on mergers and acquisitions. To my left is my colleague, Mike Witzke. He's a member and the chair of our estate planning practice group. Mike joins us today from our Detroit office. To my right is my colleague, Crystal Contini. She's a member and the chair of our mergers and acquisitions practice group. Crystal and I are both based out of Cleveland. To Crystal's right is our colleague, Ben Panter. Ben is a member and the chair of our executive compensation and governance group. Ben's visiting today from our Chicago office. To those of you with us in Cleveland today, if you have any questions, go ahead and fill out your question card and raise it, and one of the members of our team will bring the questions up to us. For those of you attending our webcast, you can email in questions to events@mcdonaldhopkins.com. And we'll make every effort to get your questions and incorporate them into our panel discussion or get them in at the end. Thanks in advance to those of you who submitted questions when registering. We have those questions, and to the extent we don't touch upon them in the panel discussion, we'll again try to get them in at the end with our other questions. So first, to get the panel kicked off here, I recently worked on a deal with an exiting founder, and they had an opportunity that many sellers don't get, that insofar as they got to interview, it was a PE deal, and they got to interview prior sellers for kind of information on their own due diligence on the PE buyer. And they learned a lot of deal-specific information, but they also got just some good insights. They got warned off backloading too much on earnout, and got some other deal pointers. So my kickoff question for the panel is, when you do post-mortems with your clients, with founders or sellers more generally, what insights do you get? What were they surprised by over the course of the deal and wish they had known from day one?
I'll start. And I've actually had the chance to interview sellers as well. And one of the things they say is that they didn't realize how important the letter of intent is. And often it's signed, months in advance of actually getting to the point where you do due diligence, actually do the sale transaction, negotiate all of the final definitive agreements. And one of the things they say is, we kept referring back to that darn letter of intent. And when I, put that one sentence in there, that's not actually, I didn't think it would carry through to the whole deal. We kind of hoped we could kind of massage the language and make things a little bit more clearer. And everyone kept referring to the letter of intent. And so to me, it always starts the leverage point. And so even though that most letters of intent are non-binding, they end up having this thread that kind of carries through the whole transaction.
I'll go next if that's okay. So while I joke in some respects, most common postmortem comment that I get is, "I'm happy I hired a lawyer." A lot of my clients are founders, non-founder CEOs, executives at companies, and when you're going through a sale process, even if you're the founder and it's your company that you started, you may have a minority interest in the company by the time you take it to exit. And so the interest of the company and the interest of the selling founder are actually not necessarily aligned in all instances. And candidly, they're not typically aligned in most instances. And so when I talk to my clients after deal, I'm really happy I hired you. I wouldn't have thought of this. I thought that the seller's lawyer were going to look out for me in this regard. And there's so many very nuanced deal terms that really flow through not just the sale transaction, but following the sale transaction terms with the buyer that are really important. And if the founder has their own counsel, they can really take advantage of the negotiation process.
I think for me, from the estate planning side, what I hear most often is, I wish we would have started this earlier. Got involved, especially when there are gifting strategies that we're employing, where we're trying to transfer some interest in the business downstream, whether it's a transfer to family members ultimately, or whether it's a transfer to a third party. If we're going to utilize gifting to minimize some of the tax effects, over and over here, I hear, gosh, I wish we would have got started 5 years earlier, whatever it may be, because that time really makes a big difference in terms of what can be done. And most of these strategies that we're using are irrevocable strategies that there's a learning curve in getting the client up to speed on it. So getting that early start on the estate planning piece of transitioning the business
Right.
is huge.
Well, I'm hearing a strong kind of thread running throughout all the comments that's can be kind of exec summaries. Be proactive, don't wait. Kind of tying up the point that Crystal made on the letter of intent. Even if you have counsel, get them involved prior to the letter of intent. What happens on so many deals is we'll get a letter of intent already signed and we're kind of stuck with certain terms, even though the letter of intent's non-binding. There is a good faith, kind of duty to not renegotiate the deal, even to the extent the letter of intent's non-binding.
And I'll say from an executive's perspective, if you can get executive-based terms, employment agreement terms, equity participation, non-competes, there's a lot of executive relevant terms that you can even address at the LOI term sheet stage where you have perhaps the greatest amount of leverage in the deal. If you can get it in at that stage, you're often best situated to negotiate going forward as opposed to starting from scratch later in the process.
Great. So, all right, Ben, this one kind of mostly directed at you, but certainly others can weigh in as well. We've talked a lot in the lead up to this about the tension between the roles that a founder will play. Talk a little bit more about that.
So when I represent executives, I talk to them about the hats they wear. And there's two real roles that a founder executive has, which is one is an owner of the company and the other is an executive. And depending upon the relationship, depending upon the term that you're dealing with, there are different negotiating points, there are different interests. It's not just from a corporate governance, but from a leverage perspective, it's important to keep in mind, are you negotiating in your capacity as an owner, or are you negotiating in your capacity as an executive? And so if you explore the various relationships that a founder has with another founder, right? So when you're negotiating with your other founder, you're really in your role as an owner of the company, and certain tension points such as what happens when my founding partner leaves the company, clearly a point of tension. You're negotiating your capacity as an owner. Probably the most sensitive relationship is between the founder, executive, and the investor in the company. As a general matter, most founders get diluted between 20 and 80% is the most recent data. And so if you're a founder, you might own 80%, you might only own 20% at the time that you're taking it to exit. And so there might be a very long runway that you're dealing with either minority or even a majority owner in your business. And that majority owner has control of the company. I have a story that I tell a lot of my clients, which is I had a founder CEO who owned a third of a company. The valuation came in at $150 million. And so his interest in the company is worth $50 million, which seems like a great result. However, his salary was $100,000 a year, and he was living in a studio in downtown Chicago. And so while on paper he potentially could buy a Caribbean island, in reality he only had $100,000 a year of cash to use. And so he needed, in the negotiation, he needed to take off his owner hat. He needed to say, we're not going to keep deploying all of our capital towards R&D and growing. I need to move into a one-bedroom, and I need to buy a new suit. And so, that story really highlighted, at least for me, the tension between the investors and the executive. And that also leads to another interesting or common tension, which is valuation. He was saying, my company, I have a $50 million interest, but that's what the valuation came out. He thought the company was worth well over $300 million, which means his interest on paper was over $100 million. And so fair market value is, again, an incredibly sensitive issue. And again, whether you're wearing your executive hat or your owner hat, there's a really big difference in whether you want a high valuation or a low valuation.
Great. And actually, that was a question that we had before the panel. How do you reconcile the large difference between founder's valuation and a professional valuation?
At the end of the day, until you take the company to the market and sell it, there really is a huge deviation particularly for growth companies.
Sure.
It's hard to, again, you can have 8 times EBITDA or 5 times revenue, and whatever the current prevailing trend is, determine a valuation. But until there is a willing buyer to buy your company, there really is no hard answer. And so it's negotiating, it's building terms in early, whether it's valuation methodologies, challenge rights, et cetera.
It's like marketing anything else. I mean, you have your comps in your industry, but until you've got that willing buyer, you really just don't know. All right, so continuing on kind of in a similar vein, let's talk about an early stage company, but one that's in a growth stage, that's looking to take on an investor, a minority investor. This is, Shark Tank has made this look a lot sexier and faster than it is, and they never show the young associate in doing due diligence somewhere in a high rise in Chicago or New York or Cleveland. But let's talk a little bit about what can a founder reasonably expect when taking on equity money, and what are investors looking for?
In my experience, a lot of the tension comes with respect to minority approval rights, board seats. Valuation again is constantly coming up. Where I really get involved is with respect to the equity-based incentive programs. And so, again, when you look at whether you're an owner or an executive, right? Executives in most companies participate in equity programs. And when I say that, I'm talking about options and profits interest, restricted stock, phantom stock. And so, depending upon whether you're wearing your owner hat, right? If you're wearing an owner hat, you probably don't want an equity pool, right? Because you're going to get diluted. If you're an executive, you need an equity pool because you need to bring in employees. Particularly for earlier stage companies where they don't have a lot of cash, your equity-based pool really is your mechanism to attract and retain your employees. And so when you're bringing in founders or an investor, it's really important as a founder to understand not only where you are, money's coming in, minority shareholder rights, et cetera, but also where do you want to go? And as Mike said initially, having that long-term strategy, in my view, is the most critical part. Whether we are definitely going public, we are definitely bringing in, going to do a B round, we're going to do a C round. Our next capital event is going to be an exit. It's really important to keep your eye on what that next event is in order to plan currently and for the future.
Well, and I would say that another reason it's important is because of how much time it's going to actually take to bring on that investor. I mean, to Frank's point, I was one of those associates in the data room, looking at all of the pieces of paper, and it takes a lot of time. So if you are, whether you're wearing your founder hat or owner hat, you're going to have investors now crawling all over your company. They want to understand, your books and records, your suppliers, who are your distributors, what do your contracts look like? And they're going to start asking questions and really digging deep into your business. And you want to be sure that you're ready to actually, number one, spend the time and effort to do it, spend the money to employ the lawyers and have your accountants available to do the valuation. And so the amount of effort and time it's going to take to get that investment is going to be large. So being prepared to have a strategy is important.
A strategy is important, and it's also important to note, you really have endless flexibility. I mean, there's threshold questions that I think a lot of early stage and growing companies don't even begin to ask. They just assume that they're going to go into this series of, as Ben was saying, A round, B round, C round, and don't even look at threshold questions like, maybe it's time to take on some debt. What kind of debt can we support? There's variable instruments like convertible debt that can be converted into equity. So really endless flexibility here. It's just going to depend upon the needs of your business and what your projections are for the future. So turning to you, Mike, we'll get to liquidity events and kind of true exits in a moment. But from the estate planning front, kind of the similar question that I asked my colleagues on the right, with a growth company, what should founders and owners, say even in the closely held business, be thinking of early stage?
Well, I think it's important that all business owners are really looking overall at their estate plan and how it's set up. And there's kind of two things, just a general review today of their estate plan, and then kind of how does tax reform now affect what they've done. In reviewing the estate plan, and we see this a lot when we get pulled in on clients either at a time of sale or sometimes after the owner has passed away, that we often see the estate planning of a business owner kind of falls into sometimes two spheres, where one, they had a business lawyer that's been helping them throughout their building this business up, and at one point they say to the business lawyer, hey, you know what, I think I probably need a will or something. Can you do that? And the business lawyer says, yeah, I think I got a form on the shelf somewhere. We can do that. And they have an estate plan in place, but it really it lacks the sophistication that that business requires. And we're actually right now in the process of audit on an estate tax return for a single man who passed away, very successful business owner, had a living trust, but had done no tax planning, no estate tax planning, and has a taxable estate. He had a living trust. He had a number of business entities, none of which had been transferred to that trust, so we had to put them all through probate. So often, they have counsel, they have an estate plan in place, but it's just not sophisticated enough for what their situation involves. Or the flip side of that is often that business owner does go see somebody who specializes in estate planning. That person puts together a sophisticated plan, but that estate planning attorney really didn't understand the business. And so you have situations where that business owner becomes incapacitated, and now they have a spouse who's acting under a power of attorney managing that company with no experience, no understanding of how that business should be run. So thinking about things like a management committee that would step in and assist the spouse or whoever's in charge if there's an incapacity situation, or even at death. Looking at, is there a buy-sell agreement in place? Is that synced with the other documents in the estate plan? Does the stock, is it owned in the record book by the living trust if they have that? If they've done gifts, have they been properly documented in the company's records? So often you pull out that record book and it hasn't really been dusted off since the company was formed, and kind of some form documents were placed in the back of it. So that's real important, just making sure that existing estate plan is up to date and it reflects the complexity of that client's situation. Then layered on top of that now is tax reform. And so this has really affected how a lot of clients have their estate plans set up, and I think you can kind of split it into two camps. So with tax reform now, the estate tax threshold has now been raised to a little over $11 million per person. So a lot of folks no longer have to worry about estate tax. And so if you look at that group of clients that you might have, or business owners that no longer have an estate tax problem, many of their estate plans were drafted with estate tax as the primary driver of the plan. So they have what are often known as AB trusts, they have credit shelter trust provisions that are fully funded upon their death, and now they pass away, and we have an irrevocable trust that the spouse now has to keep in place. They have to get a tax ID number, they have to file separate returns, and it's no longer needed for estate tax purposes. So if we look at clients that have less than 11 million, or if they're married under 22 million, we need to relook at that and really shift the focus from an estate tax focus now to an income tax focus, and looking at, are we going to get step up in basis at the death of the first spouse, and then again at the second death? Looking at retirement assets, how can we minimize the income tax effect on those? So that tax reform has really affected a lot of things. And then for those clients that are kind of that ultra high net worth that are going to still have an estate tax problem, they're over the $11 million estate size, they now have a second bite of the apple. We've got an increased exemption which allows them to make additional, often leverage gifts downstream to children. And so there's a whole nother opportunity here to do that leverage planning that we're going to talk about later. So a lot of things that pretty much all business owners have to be focused on today. And again, this is stuff you want to start early. So if we're talking about somebody who's kind of still years away from the transition or the sale of the business, you don't want to wait for that purchase agreement to be signed to start thinking about these issues.
Well, and hearing you talk about some of the nuances on the estate planning front really reinforces for me that you need to take a team approach to this, right? Because it's pretty rare that the same person is going to be able to give you the appropriate guidance on the estate planning front, and also be the person who's giving you guidance on your operating agreement, your buy-sell agreement, et cetera. So, routinely in our practice, we work together, we team together in an integrated fashion. Whether it's one firm or a team of advisors from different firms, it's really important that you take that team approach.
On that point, I think it highlights an important concept for founders, which is selling your business is one of the exit strategies, right? Mike comes into play where it's not, the selling the business is not the exit strategy, it's passing it down to a generation. We're not going to necessarily get into ESOPs, but passing your company down to your employees is another. And so while we're focusing today on minority investments, sale transactions, and succession planning, it's important to note that selling your business is not the only answer to exiting.
Right.
There are other ways that Mike works with clients all the time on.
Great, thanks. So Ben, you were talking about earlier some of the tools that a founder has in his or her toolkit to, even at an early stage when maybe there isn't the cash on the balance sheet to pay the salaries, market rate salaries. Can you give us a bit of an overview on the various types of instruments? I'm talking profits, interest, options, and really kind of compare and contrast the tax benefits for the company and also for the recipient on those types of tools?
Sure. So as a general matter, I listed there's options, profits, interest, SARs, phantom equity, restricted stock, RSUs, and so people have likely heard of the different forms of equity awards, and it's certainly important to walk through and understand there's different tax impacts both for the company and for the employee. In my experience, when companies are implementing a program, the initial call is, I want a stock option program. And they say, just want a stock option program. And so after talking to clients, before this presentation, I actually went back through my last 20 employee equity plans. Again, to be clear, we're talking about private companies here. So I went back through my last 20 private company equity plans. And I'd actually only done one traditional stock option plan. And so what that highlights is, while companies might have something in mind, once you drill down on some of the tax consequences, liquidity consequences, which is certainly one of the paramount issues for both companies and employees, you sometimes end up in a very different place. Just going through, I think 50% of the plan, again, this is just anecdotal, last 20 I've done, half of them were phantom equity programs. I had a number of profits interest programs, and I had two 409A compliant option programs. And so I promised I wouldn't talk about 409A, but I have said it once and I will not say it again. But the real takeaway is there is really not a one-size-fits-all approach when you get to equity plans. There really is, you really need to dig down on, do you want to what percentage of the company do you want to give up? How do you want to incentivize employees? Really to highlight this point, equity-based incentive programs are no longer really optional. Most companies look at them like their health plan. If you have a company that you want to grow, you need an equity program. And it's not just an equity program. You need an equity program that meets your company's corporate philosophy, its compensation philosophy, and meets both its business and growth needs.
And I think it's fair to say that the buyers are expecting to see that too.
Without question.
I mean, they want to make sure that there is incentive for the employees, number one, and there's something that they can either continue or tweak, but still find a way to incentivize the employees going forward.
Yeah, so if you look at a typical private equity sponsor, I'd say I've yet to see a private equity sponsor that doesn't have their form equity incentive program, whether it's options, profit. They're typically structured as some form of appreciation awards. But the idea that these multi-billion-dollar private equity sponsors have, just as a general rule, an equity plan anywhere from 8 to 20%, let's say, really highlights the fact that companies should have these, should explore these, and it's really expected in the current market.
And just talk a little bit, just for those in the group that may not have the familiarity with some of these plans, who are the target recipients for these plans?
So different plans obviously have different people that they are targeted at. If you look at a profits interest program, for example, a profits interest program, when you grant the profits interest, the recipient, the grantee, becomes a partner in your partnership. And so it would be, while there are plenty of instances where you would implement a broad-based profits interest program, you typically, more often than not, don't want 150 partners in your partnership. And so as a general matter, that's a great question, is how deep do you go? And do you do two different programs? I mean, I have companies that have 3 different programs. C-suite executives participate in one, senior executive have a different one, and junior level employees. And again, as there's a market expectation for these programs, in my experience, there's definitely a trend toward deeper programs. But companies need to understand that the type of program, the depth of the program, having more participants, really has a dramatic impact on your company, and you need to make sure you, again, adopt the right program.
Right. And you really have almost infinite flexibility here, right? So like, I have the greatest familiarity with profits interest, and I have lesser familiarity with some of the other tools that Ben talked about. But on the profits interest front, I mean, you've got flexibility as to vesting time, vesting over time, accelerated vesting in a liquidity event. You've got flexibility for some performance vesting as well. One thing that I saw on a particular client that took a little bit longer to get to their growth, but then they enjoyed some really significant growth, was they overused their profits interest plan. They initially had a cap of 20% on a fully diluted basis on their incentive equity plan, but they quickly got over that cap and amended their operating agreement and started giving away profits interest like candy. And that was fine when it was all kind of a hypothetical profits interest. It was less fine 3 years later when they turned the company, for a significant gain.
And that's, clearly critical so that's profits interest example. If you have a phantom equity program, what I've seen, I have 2 clients now that are facing this problem, which is the company has grown so fast that the cash outlay, so this program is settled in cash, and the cash outlay associated with this program is greater than their cash flow, and they actually literally don't have enough cash to settle this program. And again, I said I wouldn't say it, but there are meaningful 409A limitations to how they can fix this particular phantom equity program. And so when they put it in place, they were not.
All right, so you've said 409A twice, so you at least have to give like a 30-second primer on what 409A even is.
So 409A, just in case it gives anyone ease, it almost got repealed in tax reform. So it was very close, but it survives. 409A governs non-qualified deferred compensation. I think we're probably about 1,000 pages of tax regulations. It covers everything from stock options, the severance, the change of control bonuses, to just regular, I want to make don't pay me my salary this year, pay it to me in 5 years. And so very, very broad set of rules that, particularly when you're dealing with equity-based incentive programs, is one of the most critical considerations that companies need to navigate.
Right.
Well, and anytime you say equity-based incentive, I start getting nervous because then I start thinking, okay, now we're talking about a sales situation and we have a bunch of employees, and depending on where you are in the level of the company, that actually are now owners of the company. So depending on what your documents actually look like in terms of your operating agreement, your closed corporation agreement, even sometimes some of your other smaller corporate documents, you want to make sure you have provisions in there to make sure you can drag those equity players along with you whenever you do go to sell. What you don't want is the person that owns 1% of your company, who is, a mid-level manager, all of a sudden holding up your transaction and saying, I'm an owner and I don't vote for this. And then they start to get a bunch of other owners who might also have an opinion. The next thing you know, it's a democracy as to whether or not you as a founder can actually sell your company.
Your buyer probably doesn't want 97.5 of your company.
No, they don't.
Well, similar, again, I said I wouldn't mention it, but that brings in 280G, which is another, and so I can feel the eye rolling, but when you do have, it just highlights the point that when you do have employee equity holders and you are subject to 280G, which is another set of tax rules that imposes a 20% excise tax, I have a very common conversation with the owner that says, I don't want to disclose what I'm making in this deal to all of my employees. Unfortunately, one of the rules for 280G is you have to disclose to all shareholders entitled to vote. And if your employees have voting rights, you now have to disclose what the CEO and some of the other management players.
So you're basically disclosing what your parachute, the size of your parachute, right? I mean, was that an easy, simple way of overly simple
you can
way of saying it?
Yeah, the parachute is a defined term under. Yes, so basically, you have to disclose all the money you're making in the change of control, which, for a CEO who may have very close relationships with his employees, but his employees may not really understand the magnitude of the difference in levels of compensation. The 280G disclosure I've seen over and over again be an absolutely just terrible event at a time that should be really exciting for everyone.
You mean my CEO who's wearing like a black T-shirt and like chatting everybody up at the water cooler might be making 10 or 20 times as much as me?
It happens.
Okay, all right. All right, so it never really works out this way, but if you know you're going to be preparing your company for a sale event, what would be to this group's mind, kind of the corporate housekeeping checklist, or at least maybe the 5 or 6 big ticket items on that corporate housekeeping checklist if you're going to sell, say, exactly 12 months from now?
I'll say Mike stole my thunder on one of them. It's get your corporate records in order, because if you do some estate planning, particularly if you use a different lawyer than who you usually use for your day-to-day corporate work, sometimes your records don't end up matching, and often a buyer is buying stock. And so the number one thing that you're going to be making representations and warranties about in your purchase agreement is the stock ownership of your company. And if those are not locked down and appropriately set forth in your corporate record book, that is a huge issue and something that the lawyers can help clean up, but it's definitely easier if you kind of start now. The other thing I would say is kind of the financial side of your business. I think a lot of business owners, it's just them, right? If they're the founder and they own their business, they also own their home and they own their car, and I think sometimes things start to get a little commingled. You start buying a tractor through your business, and now you're using it at your house, and you start buying a car for your son, but you buy it through the business. And so all of a sudden you have all of these assets that you're actually using personally, but they got ran through your business. And so that becomes really awkward when you have to start disclosing these things on a disclosure schedule when you go to sell the business, because now you have personal assets with your company assets. And while it might have been, you could like do some creative tax returns while you were owning the business 100%, it becomes different if you're taking on an investor or getting ready to sell the business. So I think the financial reporting portion is really important. And I guess along that same vein, as a lot of companies aren't necessarily always audited, they don't always have audited financial statements. And sometimes when you go to sell the business, depending on what type of business you have, buyers might be more interested in it if you actually have audited financial statements. So kind of planning a couple of years ahead to work with your accountants to make sure you can put those in place to make your business a little bit more attractive when you go to sell. That just takes a little bit of lead time.
Audited or for sure at least reviewed.
At least reviewed.
At least reviewed financial statements. So we'll put a plug in for our accounting colleagues. It's really critical that as your business grows, not only do you have the right-sized attorneys for your business, but you have the right-sized accountants for your business too. We don't want to run into a situation where you've grown your company, you're middle market or even well into middle market company, and you're still on QuickBooks, or you have an accountant that really isn't can't prepare the financial reporting that you need. You're going to get beat up on a quality of earnings report anyway, and no buyer wants. Every buyer's looking to knock down the purchase price, but not having robust financial reporting is going to hurt you a lot.
I'd also say, to Crystal's point, which again happens in probably most, if not all, founder deals where there is some commingling. I guess my advice to founders is be open and honest with your legal team and your accountants. There's nothing wrong with making disclosures. Right. There is an expectation that there is some sort of overlap. But
and particularly in a closely held business, it's not unusual to run some personal expenses through the business. Obviously, those are all going to get backed out when you're calculating your multiples and when your buyers calculate what they're actually going to pay you for the business.
But what's worse is not disclosing it, not telling the buyer, because when it comes to light, once they take over the business, it is a lot worse, and you might actually get significantly more dinged on your purchase price than if you had just been, and again, as lawyers, we see this all the time. We can disclose it, we can massage it to make it not seem necessarily as bad as it may feel.
I think one other thing, when we're talking about the founder, often their basis in this entity is fairly low. So starting to run the numbers on what is the income tax effect of this exit on me? Because that'll often open their eyes as to, boy, are there some ways that we can minimize the taxes that I'm going to pay when I sell this business? And that's where we'll get involved in helping them with some gifting strategies, or maybe involving charity at that point as an owner of some of the shares. So there's a lot of opportunities there, but kind of giving them that wake-up call of this is the tax you're going to pay, this is this big number you're looking at, but how much of that are you going to be able to put in your bank account when we're all done?
Great.
And if I'm not mistaken, a lot of the estate planning items, at least I'm trained to call you guys before the letter of intent is signed. Yeah. So I think a lot of people sign the letter of intent and think, oh, let's do some estate planning, but it's really, you actually have to do it before the letter of intent.
Absolutely. That's where I started out saying we got to start early. And especially on a lot of these techniques, we can't do it at the 11th hour. They have to be started well in advance of the sale.
And while we're talking taxes, and Frank mentioned a year, With a lot of equity awards in particular, the long-term capital gain holding period is a year. And so I get the call probably on a weekly basis that, oh, I want to give my employee $1 million, but I want to give it to them at capital gains rates. If you haven't given it to them, or it hasn't actually been granted, a very common fact pattern is it's in an offer letter. When the company gets sold, you'll get 5% of the company. Very common fact pattern. If that's not memorialized as an actual interest, it's a sale bonus, and a sale bonus is taxed at ordinary income rates. If it's an actual interest in the company, whether it's a profits interest or a capital interest, that's taxed at capital gains. And there's a meaningful difference between ordinary income and capital gains.
Going back to this kind of good housekeeping checklist, I'll add 2 more items, or maybe more than 2. On the employee front, you make sure that you have an employee handbook that's a critical item, and also that you're adequately protecting your intellectual property, both on the employee front by having everyone sign confidentiality agreements or maybe even non-solicitation agreements or certain key people non-competes, and also on the vendor and customer and supplier front. I mean, so much of a value in a company is often its intellectual property. Make sure that you're taking adequate measures to protect that intellectual property. And then also, this is one that a lot of people don't think of, but and it is pretty proactive. But start taking a hard look at the assignment terms of your of your contracts, particularly with key suppliers and vendors. There are ways that if you know you're a year down the road from a sale, that you can make those terms more successor friendly.
Go ahead.
I'll say I want to add to your IP thing because I just actually ran into a situation. Actually, 2 deals have the same representation and warranty in the purchase agreement, which basically says all of the intellectual property that the company uses, the people that created that intellectual property have signed up to valid assignments of that intellectual property to the company. Whether you have someone create software for you, whether you have a person come in and build a platform for your company to run different processes. I think sometimes people sign the engagement letter to get that person to come in, or they use their brother or their friend who happens to be really good in IT, create a system that's used by the business, and a buyer wants to know that that person isn't going to come back and have claims to a proprietary asset that's being used by the company. And so making sure that whenever you have someone engaged to actually create intellectual property for you, getting them to assign it to you, while it's another legal piece of paper, everyone just kind of assumes it's just going to happen that way. A buyer actually wants to see an assignment.
That's a great point. All right. So we talked a little bit about before other proactive ways to deal with it. Crystal, if you don't mind, can you give us kind of a tour of some of the common elements in either a close corporation agreement or an operating agreement, those that protect both the control block and then also protect maybe minority interests?
Right. So, and I think it's big picture there, restrictions on transfer and or, I guess I talked about the drag along rights. So if you are the large founder who owns a lot of stock, you want the ability to drag along your smaller equity holders. And it doesn't just have to be a profits interest pool. It can be your other founders. So if you are one of the larger founders, you want to make sure you have the ability to drag along the others. On a similar vein, if you're actually a smaller minority partner, what you don't want, well, first of all, you probably entered into this agreement, the operating agreement, and entered into this business thinking that, this is my team. These are the people that I want to work with. Well, what happens if your team all of a sudden decides they want to sell their interests and they don't invite you to the party? And so another important aspect is what's called a tag-along right. And if they go to sell, you want the ability to tag onto their sale and actually sell your shares along with them so that you actually get the liquidity event when they get it, so that you're not stuck working with a bunch of people or owning a business with other people if you don't get stuck with them if you don't actually want to be. And so you have a chance to actually get out, get the liquidity event at the same time.
Okay. Pass that on to Ben.
Well, going off of Crystal's point on the equity, call rights are a critical component of your equity program. And so the idea being you grant an employee equity, they vest, and then they leave the company. The idea of an equity-based incentive program is to have your employees drive the value of the company. And so if they leave, most people don't want that employee continuing to participate in the growth of the business. And so if they leave, call rights are a really important mechanic to cut off departing employees, even departing founders' participation in the further growth of the company. Now, you need to think about liquidity considerations because you don't want to incentivize employees to leave, right? If you have a call right that says, I'll buy you out for fair market value if you leave, an employee quits and you buy them out, they just got liquidity before the people who continue to work at the company. And so, one of the tenets I tell my clients is you want to treat your employees that stay with you and are there at the time of the liquidity event better than the employees that have left the company.
All right, great. So now let's turn to kind of the process and dig in a little bit more to liquidity events, actual exits, sales of control. So, Crystal, when founders come to you and ask process questions, one of the threshold questions always is to use an investment banker or not to use an investment banker. What do you tell them? And then also, what sort of expectations do you set with respect to timing and process?
So I'll also give a plug to the investment banker colleagues. I think finding the right-sized investment banker for your sale can be really helpful if you know that there could be several possible bidders on your business. I think some companies, there are like one or two potential buyers in the area that they know of, and they could just go to them and say, hey, my business is for sale, could we talk? But if you actually think there's a large number of buyers out there, or frankly, you might not even know who the potential buyers are, an investment banker's role is to help target who potential bidders could be on your business and actually run a process and try to get competing bidders to the table to actually bid on your company. While I always joke and think that the lawyers end up doing a lot of work, the investment bankers do a lot of work on the front end, and usually it is a contingency fee basis. It kind of depends on the transaction.
In addition to pricing issues and maximizing pricing, I think at least one of the other values that the investment bankers bring to the table is that the sale process itself is inherently disruptive, right? And so your attorneys are going to run interference for you on many things, but not everything, right? So the investment banker can help you through the diligence process and the rest of the process to minimize some of that bumpiness, some of that noise. And what that does for the business owner, for the founders or the owners in that closely held corporation, it allows them to keep their eye on the ball and keep running the business so that the revenues don't degrade over the sales process, right? So in addition to the value of maximizing price, it really just helps minimize the noise and the bumpiness of a transaction.
I think that's true. And it also gives you another bad guy, because often when you're the seller, there is some role for you post-closing. And so it's a lot easier to have your investment banker beat up your potential buyer on price and your lawyer beat up your potential buyer on legal terms than you to have to negotiate all of those things yourself and start to spend a lot of that goodwill, because you're going to be working for this person probably, depending on how your sale is structured. You will likely be working for this person post-closing. So to have your advisors kind of take that first cut at negotiating some of those things for you, I think is really helpful. And it's also helpful because they have a really good sense of the investment bankers have a good sense of what market is for purchase price. So I think sometimes buyers will maybe try to play games or make some sort of, creative analysis as to why they should get to buy your business for this lower amount. And I think your investment banker will be better prepared to say, what, that's not really normal, that's not an actual multiple, that's really not how we judge a value.
And even where your likely buyers may be a smaller set, even one or two buyers, you may be able to negotiate a fee structure with your investment banker that if it's an identified buyer, right, where they're not bringing the power of their Rolodex to the table, but they're really just bringing the power of their project management and knowledge of the marketplace to the table, you may be able to negotiate a lower fee, one. And also having that investment banker and the rest of your team, your legal advisors on board, really keeps the pressure on that buyer, even where there's a really discrete universe of potential buyers, right? Keeps them honest, right?
Well, to Crystal's point, again, just going back to the very first thing I said, which is playing the role of the bad guy. When you're if there is a post-closing role for the founder, the selling equity holders are less focused on the founding CEO or the executive's role post-closing, right? Because they're out. But that could be a very critical, sometimes the most critical part of the entire deal is your employment and equity participation post-closing. And so having counsel that is focused on that piece apart from the selling equity holder piece is critical.
Just to emphasize, so Ben's talking about the need for independent counsel.
Correct.
Right? Not your interest in many respects will, as a founder, say owning 30% of the company or more. In many respects will be aligned with the rest of the owners, but in many respects won't be aligned. So having independent counsels can be critical. All right, so let's go on to some of the questions. And some of these tie into the idea of process that we were just starting to explore with respect to investment bankers and the rest of a sale process. I'll read two because they're fundamentally similar questions that were emailed in. And the one begins kind of promisingly. We are a smaller company that is being romanced by a similar company. What should we be doing with respect to term sheets, LOIs? What's traditionally included and what's not? So that's question one. But its twin almost is you've signed the LOI, you're complying with due diligence request, yet the buyer continues to negotiate and try to renegotiate the deal. You're feeling beat up and taken advantage of. How do you keep the buyer to stick to the framework of the LOI?
All right, so I guess I'll start with the first one, and I think I heard you say this. Did I hear you say they're being romanced by a similar company?
Yes.
Okay, so whenever I hear that, the first thing I think about is be very, very careful about what is in your non-disclosure agreement with this potential similar buyer, and that you don't give them too much information too soon, because this is likely a competitor. And so unless they have moved far down the process with you, you want to make sure that you're not divulging trade secrets and other information that if for some reason they decide not to do the deal because, oh, by the way, the deal's not final until the purchase price is paid.
Wait a second, we have an NDA. Why would they ever do that to me?
I know, but they're a competitor and they might just happen to learn something that could be relevant in their business. And without a proper non-disclosure agreement in place, you could be giving them too much information too soon. So like whenever I hear that, that's the first thing I think of. Our NDA really needs to be.
That's a great point. And the diligence process, evolves in increments, right? So early on, yes, you're disclosing financials. Yes, you're disclosing, a lot of data, but you really shouldn't be disclosing things like margin by region, or margin by product line, or margin by service line, or top 10 customers. That all can wait till much later in the process.
I agree.
So back to the question of what's inside and what's outside of the scope of an LOI, and then how do you get your buyer who signed your LOI to behave, so to speak?
So I kind of think of LOIs in kind of two genres. One is an LOI where you're granting exclusivity, and the other is an LOI when you're not granting exclusivity, and it's kind of more of a term sheet. There are different philosophies, but in my mind, if you're actually going to agree to exclusivity and you're going to dance with just this one potential buyer, I like to get more of the legal concepts up front in that letter of intent. And that would include, purchase price, not a purchase price range, an actual purchase price, because you're granting them exclusivity. And this is a place where I think your investment banker really helps. And what I will tell you is the purchase price never goes up after signing the letter of intent. Never is a strong word, but it never goes up. It's only going to go down. And so, and the reason I reference a range is if your potential buyer really wants a range, you need to be really sure that that lower end of the range is something you're willing to do the deal at, because that's probably where you're going to end up, and actually you might go below that depending on what happens in due diligence.
Right. Because even where you have a firm purchase price as opposed to a range, it's usually going to be, there's always caveats, right? It's based upon assumptions, based upon your 12-month trailing EBITDA being X.
Right.
We talked before about how sometimes X gets speed up a little bit in the quality of earnings stage.
Well, and I think having a well-negotiated letter of intent is really helpful, because as I said, I think at the beginning, that common thread, I think a lot of sellers point back to that letter of intent and say, look, this is the deal we set. And I think holding your ground is important on that. So I think getting beat up by the buyer is probably not uncommon, and I guess I will say that deal fatigue is real. I think you start to get toward the end of the transaction and the buyer starts like picking at things, and sometimes there's a point where you have to say no, and you have to put your foot down and point to the letter of intent and kind of point to the course of dealing. And honestly, that's where your lawyers can help you, because I think sometimes the seller feels like they're taking on all of that negotiation. And I think your lawyers and investment bankers can kind of help, say no, I guess, on some of those places where you're getting beat up. Well, and then maybe just to finalize the point, if you're not granting exclusivity in your letter of intent, I think having a little bit more of a let's talk, here's an outline of terms, I'm more okay with that, the outline concept, if you're not granting exclusivity, because I know you have to start somewhere, and so I don't want to kill a deal before it starts, so you don't want to try to put all of this stuff down on paper that people aren't quite ready to commit to because they haven't done enough due diligence or they haven't talked enough. So I think a piece of paper is always helpful, but if you're going to grant exclusivity, you want to get something for
Do you
it.
want to explain exclusivity quickly?
Oh, I should probably do that. So usually in a letter of intent, there's one provision, well maybe two, confidentiality, but one of the provisions that is usually binding in a letter of intent is that you, the seller, will only deal exclusively with this buyer. You won't, and this even goes as far as soliciting other bids. You will not solicit bids from anyone else. Some go as far as to say you won't even explore debt financing. You won't take on any investors, nothing. You're only going to talk to this buyer about any type of liquidity event. So this is the person you're working with. And the buyer wants this because they want to make sure that they have you committed before they spend all of this time, effort, and money on due diligence.
And if you're in exclusivity, to Crystal's point, is you want to have as many terms nailed down as possible, because you can't go leverage against somebody else.
You may be giving away, well, the exclusivity period may only be 45 or 60 days, and it might have certain renewals if milestones are hit, like a purchase agreement is delivered. You've really given away more than just those 45 or 60 days, right? Because to start from true square one, doesn't mean you're gonna have an offer in your back, a second offer in your back pocket a week later. So.
Well, and then to Mike's point, make sure you understand the tax consequences, because usually that's when you're talking about the purchase price. And I've actually had transactions get pretty far down the road and they didn't have the analysis done on what they would actually take home. And their take home was a lot less than what they thought it was going to be, and then they ended up killing the deal over it after everyone had spent a lot of time on it because they didn't understand the tax consequences of the sale. And so it wasn't as good of a deal as everyone thought.
Yeah. So.
Great. So what about other succession planning? What about where succession planning directly intersects, Mike, with estate planning?
Well, that certainly piggybacks on Crystal's point in that, founders that we work with, often they've built this business, they've made it very successful, it's like a child to them, and now they're looking at transitioning it, and it's going to be out of their life. And beyond that, they're looking at how can I transition as much of this wealth down to my children, to my grandchildren in a protected fashion. Potentially, how can I leave a legacy behind now that I've had this success, what kinds of things, and that's really where we get involved. And so you looking at now transferring interests in the business, outside of the founder's ownership, and that could be gifts, and I think what a lot of times they think about is just outright gifts where they're giving gifts of stock to children or grandchildren. I think you got to be very careful about an outright gift. Typically we prefer gifts in trust, because then you're going to have some protections, and certainly the asset protection of a gift in trust is something that's very worthwhile with divorce and bankruptcies and lawsuits. So certainly utilizing trust to protect that stock as it's passed downstream. I had a client who had given away to a child an interest in an LLC. The LLC owned undeveloped land up in Ann Arbor, and the child unexpectedly passed away. After he passed, they found out that he had done an online will, leaving his estate to a couple of his buddies. So now the family found out that they had two members of this LLC that was about to develop this undeveloped piece of property. And these guys, when they were offered some money, said, no, we'd like to ride along and see what happens with this development. So, had they made that LLC gift into a trust, that trust would have controlled when their child died where that money would go. So, we utilize a lot of these types of trusts, from just a basic gift trust that's going to hold that asset. It may even be utilizing a domestic asset protection trust to build an even additional asset protection generation after generation. Using intentionally defective grantor trusts. Ben, you mentioned it's not always a sale to a third party that's going on, but in many cases we may be trying to sell to the second generation, and so using an intentionally defective grantor trust is a way that we can minimize the capital gain tax effects, and using grantor grats as an opportunity. Lots of different things, self-canceling installment notes. There's a lot of different techniques that we have, a lot of tools that we have in our tool chest that can minimize that tax effect. So when they're looking at it and they're saying, what am I going to be left with when this closes? What can I then live off of, but also what can I pass to my children, to my grandchildren? How can I maximize what I'm going to get out of this transaction? And certainly when we start thinking about leaving a legacy, which many business owners want to do, certainly if we can get the charitable techniques involved early enough, prior to the letter of intent, and certainly prior to the purchase agreement, we can make a gift to a charitable remainder trust, or make a gift to a family foundation that now can leave that legacy going forward. Or maybe we can get involved with our local community foundation, and even looking at something like a donor advised fund. So there's a lot of opportunities for those founders, but I'm going to just keep harping on it. We've got to start early so that we can help them develop what they want to accomplish, have them think as a family as to what they want to do in terms of a legacy, and then make sure that we can educate them in the opportunities that they have to take advantage of them.
Well, and just maybe say one quick thing, because I know you're getting ready to say your lesson. I was on a panel with another one of my colleagues, I think it was probably last year, and I thought one of the most poignant things that he said is someone asked the question, what are one of the ways that you see the successful transition to the second generation? And my colleague said, make your kids pay for their stock. Make your kids actually invest in buying the stock of your company so that they actually have skin in the game. And I thought it was a really interesting point, because I think gifting is important, in even finding a way if there is a purchase of stock, to do it on a tax-free or tax minimal, tax-free, tax minimal basis. But this second generation, I think what I found to be really important is if they actually buy in, it actually starts to feel more so like their business.
Even a portion of it, right?
Even a portion of it, right? So that you are investing as the second generation, and you're actually taking some stock in that.
Well, and that actually brings us, in many respects, to the question that we got, which is skin in the game. And so, obviously, skin in the game is typically thought of as hard cash invested into the company, but from an employee perspective, it can also be skin in the game where I'm providing my services in exchange for an equity interest. Again, many, particularly early stage companies, don't have a lot of cash, and so they're compensating their employees with equity. And so a lot of these employees view the equity that they've gotten as their skin in the game, and so there's definitely a more vested interest in the company if you've actually invested, whether it's your time or your money, in the company. The actual question is, in short, is when can you implement an equity plan? And the short answer is anytime. In my view, whether it's upfront or after seed round, A round, B round, it really doesn't matter. The equity pool is really designed, the equity incentive pool is designed to grow the company. The purpose of adopting an equity plan is to benefit all owners. Owners don't adopt an equity plan because they have to. They adopt it because they want to. Again, using PE sponsors as an example, they adopt it because they want to hang a carrot out there and have management and their employees work towards certain specific goals and grow the company. And one great way to do that is to give people equity, but give them skin in the game and help them drive value. And so there is no right or wrong time to implement a pool. The follow-up question is, what's the size? There really, again, isn't a right answer. I mean, again, there's various market studies depending upon industry, company, private equity sponsor. You'd say typically 8 to 12%, with 10 being the median. Venture or startup companies are typically on the 15 to 20 wouldn't be unreasonable, with 15 probably being the median. But again, there isn't a right answer. Go ahead.
The one thing I want to say is when you mentioned any time is the right time to do an equity pool, just to be clear, if you are a founder but you have other investors, you will need their sign off on creating that equity pool. So I want to say that out loud, because any time is a great time, but you're going to need to make sure that everyone that holds equity is on board. It probably depends exactly what your operating agreement says, but those people will be diluted, and so they're going to have to be on board with your decision to do it. So.
All right, well, to tie things up, we've got another minute or two here. The question I'll put out to the panel for pretty succinct answers is, most of what we've said today, was equally true 6 months ago, 12 months ago, 18 months ago. Give me a brief on what's a trend or a change in law within, say, the last 6 to 12 months that's impacted the stuff we're talking about, or your practice.
So I will, again, enormous evolution in the executive compensation arena, particularly over the last 13 years. It really, there was nothing. Now it's really critical, both state and local governments, federal government passing legislation. And so clearly laws, tax laws, securities laws are critically important, but the short answer is really market trends. In order to be competitive in the market, your employment terms, your equity terms, your incentive plan, all those terms have to be competitive from a market perspective. There's a lot of access, available data. Employees are looking at that data. You need to understand the tax consequences, the liquidity consequences, because your employees actually may know the answers and they really care.
I would say the way the purchase price is delivered, it's not really just cash anymore at closing. It is a seller note. It could be a portion of the purchase price delivered in an earnout, which basically means usually it's a set amount. So you, the seller, have the opportunity to earn an additional, I'm making up a number, $2 million based on certain post-closing performance metrics. So a portion of your purchase price ends up being contingent on your ability to perform after the closing. So it's not just cash, it's a seller note, it's earnout, and then also rolling over equity is kind of the jargon, rolling over equity such that you get tax deferred treatment if you sell your stock, but you end up getting stock in your buyer's entity going forward. So that now you're actually participating in a piece of the buyer's success going forward. But this is not profits interest. You are actually paying value.
Right.
This is,
you're deferring a part of the cash
right.
purchase price and maybe getting a second bite at the apple. Maybe it's
Right.
only 10 or 20%, but it could be 10 or 20% of a larger pie.
exactly.
And to be clear, it doesn't have to be, sometimes it's pre-tax, sometimes it's post-tax. The rollover, the idea is that it's hard cash skin in buyer that's built into part of the purchase price.
Right.
Great.
And I think I would just say that we've got a window here with tax reform where we have an increased exemption that can be utilized to make leverage gifts. In addition, we came this close to some significant restrictions on discounting family gifting, and those restrictions didn't come to fruition, but they certainly could come back again to bite us. So we have an opportunity to make leveraged gifts and to take significant discounts in that gifting, and I think we want to make sure our clients are aware of that, because a lot of these individual tax reform items are going to sunset in 2025. So
great. Well, we promised to end by 1, and we came close. If you still have questions, you can email in questions to events@mcdonaldhopkins.com, and this webcast will be available as a rebroadcast on our website, as is a schedule of future business hours. If you can access that schedule by visiting mcdonaldhopkins.com. But otherwise, thank you for your time and attention today.